Welcome to the Burnout to Lit Up podcast. I am your host, Erica Del Pozo, occupational therapist, certified health coach, CEO and founder of Joy Energy Time, Miami Girl, and Pineapple Lover. In this podcast, we provide the resources on how to deal with stress, burnout, and anxiety, how to get energized, find true satisfaction and alignment in your life, and more. You will learn how to slay your burnout beast and go from burnt out to a lit up life. Let's do this. Welcome to episode 6 of the Burnout to Lit Up podcast. It's about to get all sciencey up in her. I am going to talk about our nervous systems and our sensory needs. Let me start off by saying that this is going to be an interesting and informative episode that you don't want to miss. Second of all, we are all sensory beings and have sensory needs. I've been fascinated with our nervous system and the whole human body since I was little. This topic on sensory modulation is hot, super hot in OT, occupational therapy, and I learned about sensory needs in my occupational therapy program. I have worked with countless kids over the past few years with sensory challenges, and many of them also have diagnoses of autism, ADHD, developmental delay, and so on. Today's fun facts will be brought up later in the episode as it pertains to my sensory needs. In this episode, I'm going to share what's important for you to know and how it's going to help you gain a better understanding of yourself or someone you know in terms of how we process sensory information. Sensory modulation just doesn't get the attention it deserves, and it could really help to explain a lot about your needs and your behaviors. I mean, the nervous system mechanisms that support modulation are many, varied, and complex, and by no means can I cover all of the models and theories just in one episode. So I'll be giving you just a little taste of it. Also, I am not an expert in this field or claiming to be one just because I've worked in it for a few years. I feel like I've just scratched the surface of it and understanding it because it is that complex. Okay, so let's get started with some questions. Do you know someone, an adult or child perhaps, that is irritable, moody, bothered by noises that other people can tune out, picky about foods and clothing, may dislike to be touched, bothered by lighting, especially fluorescent lighting, stays away from busy environments, or may prefer to be alone? Or do you know someone that always asks what when hearing is fine? They're clumsy, often appear to be daydreaming, have a high pain tolerance, or may not seem to notice cuts and bruises. The concept of a disruption in sensory modulation has emerged recently as a hot topic within the field of OT. Like I said earlier, there was an increased interest in the topic, which led to many studies and research. So let me start breaking it down for you. We have more than the 5 traditional senses that you learned about in school. We have the visual system, gustatory system, which is taste, olfactory system, smell, auditory system, sound, tactile system, touch, proprioceptive system, muscle and joint movement, knowing where your body is in space, vestibular system, balance, and your interoceptive system, which is the state of internal organs. One of the essential elements of self-organization includes the way in which we modulate sensory and motor information. Sensory modulation is part of being a human and is an ongoing process that we often pay very little attention to. I mean, we receive sensory input all the time, and now we're in an age where there's just sensory overload. You might not even realize it, but if you're driving right now, for example, you're probably not thinking about how your clothes feel against your skin. You might not be thinking about your body's position, the car mat underneath your feet and your back against the seat. If you're home, you may hear the sizzling of dinner that's being cooked, but maybe you're not paying attention to the blaring TV in the other room, the kids yelling, the sound of the AC running, the bright lights, etc. Sensory processing disorder is like a neurological traffic jam in which the senses don't work properly. That phrase was beautifully put by Anna Jean Ayers, occupational therapist, developmental psychologist, and just a truly innovative leader in the field. I have read some of her books. She describes modulation as the brain's regulation of its own activity. So now, imagine someone that has sensory processing disorder. It is so complex and varied, and each child and adult with it experiences each sense differently. Can you imagine being on high alert and hyper-tuned into every little sound and sight, or becoming distressed with any touch, whether it's the clothes you're wearing or from a hug? Or what if you're at the other end where you are aware of sensory input that could look like constant fidgeting, looking to munch on chewy or crunchy foods, looking for deep pressure by crashing into things, or constantly touching or hugging people? As we become more aware of the different strategies we tend to use to organize ourselves in order to functionally engage in meaningful life activities, we become much more aware of our unique system, tendencies, and preferences, like our habits, routines, and rituals that we use to organize ourselves so that we can participate in everyday activities. As humans, we are always looking for ways to manage our sensory needs. Do you enjoy lifting heavy weights? Then you are seeking that proprioceptive input. Do you enjoy inverted yoga poses? Yes, you are looking for that vestibular input. Do you just like eating pretzels and other crunchy snacks? Then you are seeking out that oral input. So there are millions of ways every day, different ways that we do things to meet our needs without a second thought. As Dr. Winnie Dunn puts, author and co-author of the Sensory Profile, she stated that the essence of being human is embedded in the sensory events of our everyday lives. For someone in which all the sensory processing is a-okay, little attention is needed in regards to the habitual strategies we use. Like, we don't sit there and think, oh, I am eating pretzels to meet my oral input needs, or I am doing yoga to meet my vestibular needs. We don't think about that. When you or someone you know has sensory modulation, or everything is not going as it should be, then more attention is needed in order for that person to get to an optimal state of being. People with sensory over-responsivity are more sensitive to sensory stimulation than most people. Their bodies feel sensation too easily or too intensely. They might feel as if they are being constantly bombarded with information. Consequently, these people have a fight or flight response to sensation. For example, being touched unexpectedly or a loud noise, a condition sometimes called sensory defensiveness. They may try to avoid or minimize sensations, like, for example, they may withdraw from being touched or cover their ears to avoid loud noises, or avoid going out to concerts or baseball games. I don't know why just baseball, but any loud event they may avoid going to. Now, people who are under-responsive to sensory stimuli are often quiet and passive, disregarding or not responding to stimuli of the usual intensity available in their sensory environment. So they may appear withdrawn, difficult to engage, and or self-absorbed because they do not detect the sensory input in their environment. They're under-responsive to touch and deep pressure, so that can lead to poor body awareness, clumsiness of movements, or movements that are not graded appropriately, like poor coordination. And these children or adults may not perceive objects that are too hot or too cold, and they might not notice pain in response to bumps, falls, cuts, and scrapes. people with this pattern actively seek or crave sensory stimulation and seem to have an almost insatiable desire for sensory input. They tend to constantly be moving, crashing, bumping, and jumping into things. They may need to touch everything in their environment and be overly affectionate, not understanding what is their space versus other space. And a lot of these behaviors I'm describing, I see in children because I work with children. And I think with adults can understand social cues much better. But I feel like if you're an adult and you have sensory modulation issues, then even though you know what's socially appropriate, sometimes you can't help yourself, or you withdraw because you know, okay, if I like to touch everything, or if I'm constantly fidgeting or jumping around, then that might not be socially appropriate for this event, so I'm not going to go. So I think that's a lot of these things come out. You see them in kids because they don't really know yet. They're trying to regulate themselves and they don't know, like I said, their space versus other people's space. So it might come out as behaviors, right? Sensory seekers are often thought to have attention deficit or ADHD or ADD. And I think it's interesting how I treat kids that have these different conditions, and it goes hand in hand almost with their need to seek sensory input or avoid sensory input. And each person is different. So there's no formula for how people are, because everyone has specific and unique sensory needs. I find it so interesting because I believe if your sensory needs aren't met, then you aren't able or have the capacity to be your best self. In the kids that I have that can't communicate, this does come out in maladaptive behaviors. Okay, so in my situation, my little fun fact is I have noticed growing up and now as an adult, I am over responsive to light touch, sounds, and busy environments. So I seek deep pressure because deep pressure overrides like the invasiveness of light touch. So for me, and for the kids I work with, I like to start with activities that have a lot of deep pressure because it's really organizing for your sensory system. So as a kid and adult, I would say I kind of freak out with light touch. I hate it. I get bothered when people are too close to me, or I get bothered by light blankets. For example, I need a heavy blanket. I will wrap myself like a burrito if I'm sleeping at someone's house or in a hotel or whatever, and I'm given a light blanket and I really don't have a choice. I have to wrap it around me so I feel really tight because I have to feel that I can't like stand light touch. In terms of the busy environment, when I was younger, I had a lot of social anxiety because I was so overwhelmed in busy, noisy, loud environments. But now I've really desensitized to it so I can tolerate it without going into a panicky mode or without having a meltdown. I do like now, I love going to different bars and restaurants. I love trying new foods. I love going to new places, and they're usually crowded, and sometimes I'm not a fan of it, but I've gotten over it and desensitized. But I do know that I have to recharge my batteries. I need alone time or some downtime after being around a lot of people. Going back to the deep pressure, I like lifting heavy weights. I love doing body weight exercises, handstands. I love how it makes me feel. And when I was a student in grad school, I told my teacher that I was having a lot of anxiety. And this was the teacher that taught us all about the sensory integration and sensory processing. So she asked me, do you work out? Do you lift weights? And in grad school, I was still kind of dancing a little bit. I stopped, but then I was like a lot of running. and I wasn't lifting weights. And she's like, maybe you should lift weights because that deep pressure and that heavy input is going to be very organizing for your body. And so I have been doing that for years now, and I find it so very helpful because it's true that deep pressure, it organizes me, and so does yoga, and also yoga for the mindfulness too, I love. So I think that's why I've been able to keep up with my workouts for like my whole adult life in some way or another, because it's a part of me. I need it. My sensory system needs it. I go crazy without exercising for a few days. Like I have to move. Even on an airplane, like on those long international flights, I have to get up and stretch, and it just feels good. Occupational therapist Patricia Wilbarger coined the term sensory diet, and it has been traditionally used in occupational therapy when using a sensory integration or a sensory modulation framework. I love sensory diets. A sensory diet may have nothing to do with what you eat, although food can be a part of it. But what a sensory diet means is that it is made up of experiences a person needs in order to self-organize and function every day. I have written many sensory diets for kids I work with, and it's about creating a daily or a weekly schedule, including things that person finds most beneficial and purposeful in order, like that's what you start with in beginning to plan a sensory diet for someone. Occupational therapists, we have the education and training necessary to write sensory diets based on the person's needs. Currently, sensory diets are being created and used in very innovative ways across all age groups and among a variety of populations. Unfortunately, sensory processing disorder isn't a recognized medical diagnosis at this time. Despite the lack of widely accepted diagnostic criteria, occupational therapists like myself commonly see and treat children and adults with sensory processing challenges like the ones I described in this episode. Treatment is very individualized and depends on that person's needs. So if you feel like you can relate that you're over-responsive or under-responsive and you feel like, okay, maybe this is why I can't really focus at work or in school, or, or you have a child that you can kind of see this and you thought, okay, this child's just acting badly, but when you look at it and really think about it, it's just their way of seeking sensory input. It's really eye-opening to bring sensory needs into the picture because, like I said, we are all sensory beings. And we have to pay attention to our needs. So even if you don't have a sensory processing disorder, if you don't give your body the sensory input that you need and that you're seeking, then you start to think, okay, how can I function? Like, for example, I can't sit at an office all day. I have to stand up. I have to move. I'm a little fidgety sometimes, and I seek deep pressure a lot to help me calm myself and organize my body. So just think about how can I really look at my sensory needs and how can I honor that and how can I make the most out of that so that I could be my best, give my most attention at work, etc., help my kids be their best. So that's really important to take a look at that. So if you're like, okay, I need a sensory diet now, well, you're in luck. This episode is brought to you by my brand spanking new quiz on my website. After you take the quiz, you will get a sensory toolkit freebie sent to your inbox. You'll learn how to build your own sensory toolkit for yourself or someone else. So cool, right? Okay, so I will definitely also do another episode on sensory needs and maybe bring someone else in to get really deep and nitty gritty about the self-regulation aspect, cognitive flexibility, impulse control, and all that good stuff. Would you be interested in learning more about that? Send me an email at erica ERIKA at joyenergytime.com if you want to hear more and learn more about sensory integration and how that applies to you and your life. Thanks for listening. If you want more, be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Also, share this episode with your friends, and I would be so grateful. If you feel inspired, leave a review on iTunes with an honest comment and or what you'd like to hear more of so you can help me out on my journey in delivering meaningful content. Thanks, mis amores.